far above the glowing streets of Metropolis, where steel towers rise beneath endless city lights. The story of Lex Luthor unfolds not simply as the tale of a villain, but as the journey of a man shaped by brilliance, ambition, fear, and the desperate need to control a world he believed was slowly slipping beyond humanity's reach. From a gifted young mind in Smallville to one of the most powerful figures on Earth, Lex Luthor's rise becomes deeply connected to the arrival of Superman, a being who challenged everything he believed about power, progress, and human destiny. Tonight, as the noise of the world slowly fades into silence, we follow the entire story of Lex Luthor, a story filled with pride, isolation, obsession, and the quiet tragedy of a man who may have wanted to save humanity in all the wrong ways. The silence before power, a mind begins to form. In the beginning, before the world learned to say his name with either fear or admiration, before the towering buildings and the quiet influence that seemed to reach into every corner of a city, there was only a boy who noticed things more carefully than most. A boy who saw patterns where others saw noise, who asked questions not out of curiosity alone, but out of a need to understand why things worked the way they did, and why so many people seemed content not knowing. This boy, who would one day become Lex Luthor, did not begin as a symbol of power, but as a quiet mind, moving through a world that often felt too slow, too simple, and at times, strangely unbalanced. It is easy to think of intelligence as something bright and effortless, like a light that guides the way forward. But for him, it felt different, almost like standing in a room where everything is visible at once. Every flaw, every weakness, every small mistake that others overlook, and realizing that once you see these things, you cannot choose to ignore them again. While other children played without thinking too deeply about the rules of their games, he found himself questioning why those rules existed at all, and whether they could be improved, controlled, or even replaced with something more efficient, something that made more sense to him, even if it made less sense to everyone else. There is a certain quiet distance that forms when a person begins to see the world in this way, not because they choose to step away from others, but because the gap between how they think and how others think becomes too wide to easily cross. And for him, this distance did not appear suddenly, but grew slowly, almost gently, like a shadow stretching across a room as the day begins to fade. Conversations that once felt simple became layered with thoughts he did not share, and moments that others found enjoyable began to feel incomplete, as if something important was always being left unsaid. In this early space of his life, there were no grand plans yet, no clear desire to rule or to stand above others, but there was something quieter, something more subtle, a growing belief that the world was not as it should be, and that if no one else was willing or able to fix it, then perhaps someone would have to step forward and take control, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, as if order itself depended on the presence of a mind capable of shaping it. This belief did not arrive as a loud declaration, but as a series of small realizations that connected over time, each one building upon the last, forming a kind of silent structure within him, where logic stood above emotion, and where decisions were guided not by how things felt, but by how they worked. While others learned to follow rules, he began to study them, to test their limits, to understand where they failed, and how they could be replaced with something stronger, something more reliable, something that could not be easily broken. And yet, even in this growing structure of thought, there was a quiet tension, something that did not fully settle, because intelligence, while powerful, does not always bring comfort, and for him, it often brought the opposite, a constant awareness of how fragile systems could be, how easily trust could be misplaced, and how often people chose belief over truth simply because it was easier, simply because it allowed them to move through their lives without the weight of questioning everything. It is in this tension that we begin to see the earliest shape of pride, not the loud kind that demands attention, but a quieter form that grows from the understanding that one sees more clearly than others, that one understands what others do not, and that this understanding carries with it a kind of responsibility, even if that responsibility is never openly accepted. Pride, in this sense, does not begin as arrogance, but as certainty, a steady confidence in one's own thinking, a belief that if the world were guided by logic rather than emotion, by structure rather than chance, it could become something better, something stronger, something more controlled. But with this certainty comes isolation, not as a punishment, but as a natural result of thinking differently, because when a person begins to trust their own mind above all else, it becomes harder to rely on others, harder to accept guidance, harder to believe that anyone else sees the world with the same clarity. And so, little by little, without any clear moment of separation, he begins to stand apart, not physically, but mentally, as if he is always one step removed from the people around him, observing rather than participating, analyzing rather than simply existing. This isolation is not filled with loneliness in the way one might expect, because for him, it feels almost necessary, almost logical, as if closeness could introduce unpredictability, and unpredictability could lead to failure, and failure is something he begins to view not as a possibility, but as something to be avoided at all costs. In this way, connection becomes less about shared experience and more about usefulness, about whether someone adds to the system or disrupts it, about whether they contribute to order or create chaos. And still, beneath all of this, there remains something human, something quieter and harder to define, a sense that while he understands the world in ways others do not, he is also separated from something they possess, something less precise but perhaps more comforting, a way of existing without needing to control every outcome, without needing to question every structure, without needing to carry the weight of constant awareness. This realization does not soften his thinking, but it lingers, like a distant thought that never fully fades, reminding him that there is more to the world than logic alone, even if he chooses not to follow that path. As time moves forward, these early patterns do not disappear, but grow stronger, more defined, more structured, shaping the way he sees everything that comes next, from opportunity to challenge, from success to conflict. And while the world will one day come to know him as a figure of power, as someone who stands against forces greater than most could imagine, it is here, in this quiet beginning, that the foundation is formed, not through a single moment, but through a series of small, steady shifts in understanding, each one bringing him closer to the belief that control is not just desirable, but necessary. And so, before the rise of influence, before the clash with ideals that will define his future, there is only this stillness, this quiet shaping of a mind that sees the world not as it is, but as something that can be redesigned, restructured, and ultimately controlled. A mind that does not wait for change, but prepares to create it, even if the cost of that creation is a distance that can never fully be closed, a silence that grows not from absence, but from the presence of too much understanding, too much awareness, and a belief that once formed will not easily be undone. Smallville shadows, the boy who would not kneel. There are places in the world that feel small, not because of their size, but because of how quietly they move, where the days pass in familiar patterns, where people know each other by name, and where life follows a rhythm that rarely changes. And it is in a place like this, in the quiet fields and long roads of Smallville, that the boy who would one day become Lex Luthor begins to see the edges of limitation more clearly than most. Smallville is not loud or demanding, and it does not ask much from the people who live there. Yet, for a mind that is always searching for something beyond what is already known, it can feel like a space that holds more boundaries than possibilities, more repetition than progress, and more questions than answers. For many, this town offers comfort, a sense of belonging that comes from shared routines and simple expectations. But for him, comfort is not something he seeks, because comfort suggests that things are already good enough and that there is no need to change them. And this idea, though peaceful to others, feels incomplete to him, as if accepting the world as it is means ignoring everything it could become. Even as a child, he notices how people accept limits without asking where those limits come from and why they must remain. And this quiet acceptance begins to trouble him, not in a loud or angry way, but in a steady, growing sense that something important is being overlooked. In school, he learns quickly, often more quickly than those around him. And while this might seem like an advantage, it creates a distance that is difficult to close. Because understanding something before others do can make it harder to share that understanding, harder to slow down, harder to feel connected to the pace of those who are still learning step by step. Teachers may see potential, but they also see a student who does not always follow the expected path, someone who questions instructions rather than simply obeying them, someone who wants to know why a rule exists before deciding whether it deserves to be followed. Outside the classroom, the world feels just as limited, though in different ways, because Smallville is a place built on routine, where fields stretch out in quiet rows and days are shaped by work that repeats itself with only small changes. And while there is something steady and reliable in this pattern, it also suggests a life that remains the same, a life that does not reach beyond its own borders. And for him, this idea feels like a kind of stillness that is too heavy, too fixed, as if the future is already decided before it has even begun. It is here, in this space between understanding and restriction, that a deeper feeling begins to form. Not yet anger, not yet frustration, but something quieter and more persistent. A sense that the world is holding back, that it is capable of more, but chooses not to move forward. And this feeling does not fade as time passes, but grows stronger, shaping the way he sees everything around him. From the systems that govern daily life to the people who accept those systems without question. And then, somewhere within this quiet town, there is the presence of something that does not belong to its limits, something that moves beyond its rules, something that does not seem bound by the same restrictions that define everything else. And though it is not yet fully understood, though it is not yet something he can clearly define, it begins to take shape in his thoughts as a kind of contrast, a reminder that not all things are held back by the same forces. This presence, which will one day be known clearly as Superman, does not immediately appear as an enemy, nor even as a rival, but as a question, a quiet challenge to everything he has begun to believe about the world. Because if there exists something that is not limited in the same way, something that can move beyond what others accept as fixed, then what does that mean for the rest of humanity? And more importantly, what does it mean for someone who has already begun to see those limits as problems to be solved rather than truths to be accepted? This question does not arrive with clear answers, but it lingers, growing slowly, shaping the way he interprets everything that follows. At first, the presence of this difference might seem almost inspiring, a sign that limits can be broken, that the world is not as fixed as it appears. But this feeling does not remain simple for long, because the more he thinks about it, the more it begins to raise another question, one that is harder to ignore. And that question is not about possibility, but about fairness. If one being can exist beyond limitation, then why cannot others? And if such power is not earned but simply exists, then what does that say about effort, about intelligence, about the work he has already begun to value so deeply? This is where the shift begins, not as a sudden change, but as a gradual turning of thought, where admiration begins to mix with doubt, and doubt begins to shape itself into something more solid, something that does not easily fade. Because for someone who believes that progress should come through understanding, through effort, through the careful building of knowledge and control, the idea of something existing beyond all of that, without explanation, begins to feel less like hope and more like a disruption, something that does not fit into the system he is trying to understand. And so, without fully realizing it at first, a quiet resistance begins to grow, not directed outward in any clear way, but held within, shaping the way he interprets what he sees, shaping the way he thinks about power, about control, about what it means to stand above others. This resistance is not loud, not emotional, but steady and logical, built from questions that do not have satisfying answers. from observations that do not align with the structure he is trying to create. In this way, Smallville becomes more than just a place of early life, because it becomes the setting where these ideas first begin to take root, where limitation is not just experienced, but studied, where difference is not just noticed, but questioned, and where the presence of something greater does not inspire acceptance, but rather a deeper need to understand, to explain, and eventually to challenge. As the days continue, and as the quiet patterns of the town remain unchanged, these thoughts do not disappear, but grow stronger, more defined, shaping a mindset that does not easily bend. A mindset that does not accept what it cannot explain, and that does not yield to what it cannot control. It is here that we begin to see the earliest form of a belief that will continue to develop over time. The belief that no force, no matter how powerful or mysterious, should stand beyond understanding, beyond logic, beyond the reach of a human mind determined to uncover its truth. And within this belief, there is a quiet refusal, not spoken aloud, not expressed in action, but present in every thought that follows. A refusal to kneel before what cannot be explained, a refusal to accept limits simply because they exist, and a refusal to allow any force, no matter how great, to define the boundaries of what he believes is possible. So even in the stillness of Smallville, where life moves gently and without urgency, something important is already taking shape, something that does not match the calm surroundings, something that grows quietly beneath the surface, a mindset that sees the world not as something to belong to, but as something to question, to challenge, and eventually to reshape, no matter how long it takes, and no matter what stands in the way. Fire and reinvention, the birth of a new self. There are moments in a life that do not announce themselves as turning points, moments that arrive without warning and pass without explanation, yet leave behind a mark so deep that everything that comes after begins to follow a different path. And for the young man who would one day be known as Lex Luthor, that moment does not come as a quiet thought or a slow realization, but as something far more sudden, something that breaks the shape of his world and forces him to see himself not as he was, but as something he must now become. It begins not with a plan, but with a loss, the kind of loss that does not offer time to prepare or space to understand, the kind that removes what once felt permanent and replaces it with a silence that feels too large, too empty, and yet strangely clear, as if the noise of everything that came before has been swept away, leaving behind only what cannot be ignored. In this silence, there is no comfort, but there is focus, a sharp awareness that what has been taken cannot be restored, and that whatever comes next must be built from what remains. The details of such a catastrophe are often remembered differently depending on who tells the story, and over time, they may change, becoming shaped by perspective, by memory, and by the need to find meaning in something that may not have had any to begin with. But what matters most is not the exact form it took, but the effect it had, the way it forced a shift from one way of seeing the world to another, the way it removed any lingering belief that stability could be trusted, and replaced it with the understanding that everything, no matter how strong it appears, can be broken. For someone who has already begun to value control, this realization does not lead to surrender, but to a deeper need for order, a stronger desire to create systems that cannot fail, structures that cannot be easily undone, and a life that is not left to chance or to forces that cannot be predicted. Loss, in this sense, does not weaken him, but sharpens him, turning uncertainty into motivation, turning absence into direction, and turning what could have been an ending into the beginning of something far more deliberate. There is also a physical transformation that comes with this moment, something visible, something that cannot be hidden or ignored. And while others might see it as damage, as a sign of what has been taken, he begins to see it differently, not as a loss of identity, but as the removal of something unnecessary, something that belonged to a version of himself that no longer exists. This change becomes a symbol, not of what has been destroyed, but of what has been revealed, a clearer version of who he is, stripped of anything that does not serve the path he now begins to follow. It is in this space, where past and future no longer feel connected, that reinvention begins, not as a sudden decision, but as a series of choices that slowly build into something larger, something more defined, something that replaces the uncertainty of what was lost with the certainty of what can be created. He does not look back in the way others might, does not hold on to what cannot be changed, because to him, looking backward offers no solution, no improvement, no control, and so he turns forward, not with hope, but with purpose. This purpose is not driven by emotion alone, because emotion, as he has come to understand, can shift, can weaken, can lead to decisions that are not fully thought through. And so, he builds his path on something more stable, something more reliable, something that can be tested and refined, something that does not depend on how he feels, but on what he knows. Knowledge becomes the foundation, and from that foundation, everything else begins to grow. He studies more deeply, works more intensely, and begins to shape himself not just through thought, but through action, aligning every step with the idea that nothing should be left to chance, that every outcome should be influenced, guided, or controlled in some way. This does not happen in a loud or visible way, but in quiet moments, in long hours, in decisions that may seem small at first, but connect over time into something much larger, something that begins to define not just what he does, but who he is. Ambition, which once existed as a quiet presence, now becomes more focused, more directed, no longer just a feeling that something greater is possible, but a belief that something greater is necessary. That rising above others is not simply a goal, but a requirement, a way to ensure that the kind of loss he experienced cannot happen again, not because it is prevented, but because he is no longer in a position where he can be affected by it in the same way. There is also a shift in how he sees other people, because where there was once a distance created by difference in thought, there is now a clearer separation, a sense that most individuals move through life without fully understanding the systems that shape it, without questioning the structures that guide their choices. And while this does not make them less valuable in a general sense, it places them in a different position in his mind, not as equals in vision, but as parts of a larger system that can be observed, predicted, and, if necessary, directed. This way of thinking does not come with anger, but with certainty, a calm belief that if the world is to become something better, it must be shaped by those who can see it clearly, those who can understand its weaknesses and improve them, those who are willing to make decisions that others may avoid. In this belief, there is a quiet justification, not for control itself, but for the need to guide, to lead, to stand above rather than within. And so, the decision begins to form, not as a single moment of realization, but as a steady conclusion reached over time. The decision that he will not remain limited by the circumstances that shaped him, that he will not be defined by what was lost, and that he will not accept a place within a system that he believes can be improved. This decision is not spoken, not declared, but held within, shaping every action that follows, guiding every choice, and setting a direction that becomes harder to change with each step taken. What emerges from this process is not simply a new version of the same person, but something different, something more focused, more controlled, more deliberate, a self that is built rather than grown, designed rather than discovered. And in this design, there is little room for uncertainty, little space for anything that does not serve the purpose that now defines him. And while the world outside continues as it always has, moving through its patterns and routines, something within him has shifted in a way that cannot be undone, a transformation that does not rely on recognition or approval, but exists quietly, steadily, shaping a future that has not yet been revealed, but is already being built, piece by piece, through thought, through action, and through a belief that once formed, will not easily be set aside. In this way, the fire that marked the end of one part of his life does not leave behind only destruction, but also a kind of clarity, a sense that what remains is stronger, more defined, and more capable of becoming something greater, not through chance, but through intention. And it is this intention, this quiet, unwavering focus, that begins to set him apart, not just from who he once was, but from everyone around him, placing him on a path that leads not simply forward, but upward, toward a position where control is not just desired, but expected, and where the idea of rising above all others is no longer a distant thought, but a direction that feels inevitable. The architecture of genius, building a mind like a machine. As the years move forward and the distance between who he once was and who he is becoming grows wider, the life of Lex Luthor begins to take on a different kind of structure, not one shaped by chance or by simple growth, but one carefully built, piece by piece, like a system designed to serve a single purpose, where every thought, every action, and every decision is placed with intention, not just to succeed, but to ensure that success is not left to uncertainty. This is not the kind of intelligence that rests on natural talent alone, nor is it driven by curiosity in the way most people understand it, because for him, learning is not about discovering something new simply for the joy of knowing, but about gaining control, about understanding how things work so that they can be shaped, improved, or replaced entirely. In quiet rooms filled with books, notes, and ideas that stretch far beyond what others his age might consider, he begins to build a mind that does not wander, but focuses, that does not accept answers without testing them, and that does not settle for what is already known when there is always something deeper to uncover. Subjects that others may find difficult become pathways for him, ways to see how systems operate, how patterns repeat, and how small changes can create large results. Science, mathematics, engineering, and even the study of human behavior begin to blend together, not as separate fields, but as parts of a larger design, a way of viewing the world where everything connects, where everything can be understood if examined closely enough. There is a certain rhythm to the way he thinks, almost like the steady movement of a machine, where each idea leads to another, where conclusions are not rushed but built step by step, and where mistakes are not failures, but information to be studied and corrected. This way of thinking does not leave much room for distraction, because every moment becomes an opportunity to refine the system he is creating within his own mind, a system that grows more complex, more efficient, and more powerful over time. But within this growing structure, there is also a shift in purpose, something that separates him from those who study simply to learn. Because while others may seek knowledge to understand the world, he seeks it to shape the world, to move beyond observation and into control, to take what exists and reorganize it into something that aligns with his vision of how things should be. This is where the difference becomes clear, where intelligence is no longer just a gift, but a tool, something that can be used, directed, and applied with precision. In this process, strategy begins to take form alongside knowledge, because understanding how something works is only the first step, and knowing how to use that understanding is what truly matters. He studies not just ideas, but outcomes, not just systems, but the ways in which they succeed or fail. And from this, he begins to develop a way of thinking that is always several steps ahead, always considering possibilities, always preparing for results before they happen. It is not enough to solve a problem. The problem must be prevented from appearing again or turned into something useful. This merging of science and strategy does not happen suddenly, but grows over time, shaped by constant effort and careful attention, until it becomes natural, until thinking in this way is no longer something he does, but something he is. And as this happens, another element begins to weave itself into the structure, something less visible but just as powerful, something that does not come from study or observation, but from belief. A belief in his own ability to see what others cannot, to understand what others overlook, and to act where others hesitate. This belief, which might seem like confidence at first, begins to deepen into something stronger, something more fixed, because as he continues to succeed, as he continues to prove his understanding through results, it becomes harder to doubt his own thinking, harder to consider that there might be limits to what he can achieve. What begins as trust in his abilities slowly grows into certainty, and certainty, when left unchecked, begins to shape the way he sees everything around him. People, in this view, are no longer just individuals moving through their own lives, but parts of a larger system, elements that can be studied, predicted, and influenced. And while this does not remove their importance, it changes how they are perceived, not as equals in understanding, but as variables in a structure that can be guided toward a desired outcome. This does not feel cruel to him, because it is not driven by a desire to harm, but by a belief that guidance is necessary, that without direction, systems fail, and when systems fail, people suffer. From this perspective, the idea begins to take shape that humanity itself, with all its strengths and weaknesses, may not be capable of reaching its full potential without help, without someone who can see the larger picture, someone who can guide decisions, correct mistakes, and ensure that progress moves in the right direction. This idea does not come with doubt, because to him it feels logical, almost obvious, a conclusion drawn from everything he has observed and learned. And so, the question is no longer whether control is needed, but who is best suited to provide it. And in answering that question, he does not look outward, does not search for someone else to take on that role, because every piece of evidence he has gathered points back to the same conclusion, that he himself is the one most capable, the one most prepared, the one who understands not just how the world works, but how it could work if guided correctly. This belief does not demand attention or approval, because it exists quietly, firmly rooted in his thinking, influencing every choice without needing to be spoken aloud. It shapes how he approaches problems, how he interacts with others, and how he plans for the future, always with the understanding that his role is not simply to exist within the world, but to shape it, to improve it, to bring it closer to what he believes it should be. At the same time, this way of thinking creates a kind of separation that continues to grow, because when a person begins to see themselves as responsible for guiding others, it becomes harder to relate to them as equals, harder to share in their uncertainties, their doubts, and their way of seeing things. This does not create open conflict, but a quiet distance, a sense that while he moves among others, he is not truly part of the same experience, not bound by the same limitations, not guided by the same thoughts. And yet, within this carefully built system, there is little room for hesitation, because doubt, once allowed, can weaken structure, can introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty is something he has worked too hard to eliminate. Every idea is tested, every plan is refined, and every step is taken with purpose, creating a path that feels not only controlled, but inevitable, as if everything he has built within himself is leading toward a future that is already taking shape. In this way, the mind he has created becomes more than just a way of thinking, because it becomes a tool, a framework through which he understands and interacts with everything around him. A system that does not rest, does not slow, and does not accept limits without question. It is precise, efficient, and always moving forward, always seeking to improve, to control, and to refine. And as this structure continues to grow, becoming more complex and more powerful with time, it begins to define not just his actions, but his identity, shaping the person he is becoming into someone who does not simply react to the world, but plans for it, who does not wait for change, but creates it, and who does not accept the idea that humanity must find its own way, but believes, with steady certainty, that it must be guided, carefully, deliberately, and above all, intelligently. Because in the end, for Lex Luthor, intelligence is not just about understanding the world, but about mastering it, about shaping it into something better, something stronger, something that reflects the clarity of his vision, even if that vision stands apart from the rest, even if it leads him further away from those who do not see the world in the same way. And even if it places him on a path where control is not just a goal, but a responsibility he believes only he can fulfill. Metropolis ascending, power takes its first throne. When he first comes into Metropolis, the city does not welcome him with a single moment that feels important, because cities like this do not pause for anyone. They move with a steady energy that continues whether a person succeeds or fails, whether they rise or disappear. And yet for Lex Luthor, the arrival is not about being welcomed, but about entering a place where influence can finally take shape in ways that were not possible before. The buildings stand tall, the streets carry constant movement, and the systems that keep everything running are far more complex than anything he has experienced. And instead of feeling overwhelmed, he begins to see structure, layers of opportunity hidden within the motion, patterns of behavior that can be studied, understood, and eventually shaped. Metropolis is not just a city of people, but a city of systems, where business, technology, and communication come together in ways that allow ideas to grow quickly. And for someone who has spent years preparing a mind that looks for control, this environment feels less like chaos and more like a map waiting to be read. Companies rise and fall based on decisions made behind closed doors. Industries shift based on innovation and timing, and wealth moves in ways that can seem unpredictable to most. But to him, these movements are not random. They follow rules, even if those rules are not always visible at first. He begins quietly, not by demanding attention, but by observing, by learning how the city breathes, how it responds to pressure, how it reacts to change. And in these early moments, there is patience, a willingness to move carefully, to understand before acting, because he knows that power built too quickly can collapse just as easily. Every connection made, every opportunity taken, and every risk calculated becomes part of a larger plan, one that is not fully visible to others, but is always present in his thinking. Wealth does not come to him by chance, and it does not come through a single breakthrough, but through a series of decisions that build on one another, each one strengthening his position, each one expanding his reach. And as resources begin to grow, so does his ability to influence the world around him. Businesses that others might overlook become valuable when placed in the right context. Technologies that seem small at first reveal their potential when developed with purpose. And partnerships that appear ordinary become powerful when guided by someone who understands how to align interests toward a single goal. There is a certain precision in the way he moves through this process, because nothing is left to guesswork, nothing is allowed to drift without direction. And while others may see success as a result of luck or timing, for him, it is the result of careful design, of seeing connections where others see separation, of building systems that support one another rather than stand alone. Over time, this approach begins to change how he is seen, not just as someone who is capable, but as someone who is effective, someone whose presence begins to shape outcomes in ways that are difficult to ignore. As his influence grows, so does the structure around him, because wealth alone is not enough. It must be organized, directed, and expanded, and this leads to the creation of something larger, something that moves beyond individual effort and becomes a force within the city itself. Corporations begin to take form under his control, not as simple businesses, but as networks of power, where each part serves a purpose, where each decision is made with a broader vision in mind, and where growth is not just measured in numbers, but in reach, in influence, in the ability to affect change on a scale that extends beyond what most people can see. In this stage, Metropolis begins to shift in his eyes, no longer just a place where he exists, but a space that can be shaped, a kind of kingdom not in the traditional sense, but in the way that power can be held and directed without the need for titles or crowns. The city becomes something he studies constantly, not as a whole, but in parts, in systems, in flows of information, of money, of movement. And through this study, he begins to understand not just how the city functions, but how it can be guided, how small changes in one area can create larger effects in another. At the same time, there is another layer to this relationship, because Metropolis is not only a place of control, but also a place of testing, a laboratory where ideas can be put into action, where theories can be observed in real time, and where results can be measured and refined. New technologies are developed not just to succeed in the market, but to explore what is possible, to push boundaries, to see how far systems can be extended before they reach their limits. And in this process, the city itself becomes part of the experiment, part of the ongoing effort to understand and improve the structures that hold everything together. People within the city begin to respond to his presence in different ways, some seeing him as a leader, others as a competitor, and some as something they cannot fully define, because his approach does not always match what they expect. He does not rely on charisma alone, nor does he depend on tradition, but instead uses knowledge and planning as his primary tools, creating outcomes that often feel inevitable once they have been set in motion. This creates a kind of reputation, one that grows quietly but steadily, shaping how others interact with him, how they prepare for his involvement, and how they react when his influence becomes clear. Despite this growing power, there is no moment where he pauses to admire what has been built, because for him, achievement is not an end, but a step, a point from which further progress can be made. And so the work continues, expanding, refining, and strengthening the structures he has created. Every success leads to new questions, new possibilities, and new challenges. And rather than slowing down, this only increases his focus, pushing him to think further ahead, to consider not just what is happening now, but what could happen next. Within this expanding system, there is also a deepening belief, one that has been forming for a long time, that the kind of order he is creating is not just beneficial, but necessary, that without direction, without careful planning, systems will fail and people will suffer as a result. This belief does not come from a desire to control for its own sake, but from a conclusion reached through observation and experience, a conclusion that shapes how he justifies his actions, how he views his role within the city, and how he plans for the future. Metropolis, in this sense, is more than just a location. It is a proving ground, a place where ideas become reality, where control becomes visible, and where the foundation of something much larger begins to take shape. It is here that power moves from concept to action, from thought to influence, and from potential to presence, creating a position that is not easily challenged because it is built on systems that support one another, systems that have been designed with care and precision. And as this process continues, as influence becomes stronger and more widespread, the city itself begins to reflect the changes, not in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts, in how decisions are made, in how opportunities are created, and in how outcomes begin to align with the structures he has put in place. This does not happen all at once, but gradually, over time, until the presence of his influence becomes something that cannot be ignored, even if it is not always fully understood. In this way, the arrival in Metropolis marks more than just a change in location, because it represents the moment where preparation meets opportunity, where knowledge meets application, and where a vision that once existed only in thought begins to take form in the world itself. It is the first true throne, not one given or inherited, but one built, shaped, and secured through effort, through understanding, and through a belief that the world, when guided correctly, can be made to reflect the clarity of a single mind. And within this growing structure, as the city continues to move and change around him, there is a quiet certainty that this is only the beginning, that the systems he has created will continue to expand, that the influence he has established will continue to grow, and that the role he has taken within this space will not remain limited to one city, but will extend further, reaching into areas that have yet to be touched, shaping a future that is still unfolding, but already being built with each decision he makes. The arrival of the impossible, a god among men. There comes a point when even the most carefully built plans begin to meet something they were never designed to face, something that does not follow the same rules, something that cannot be measured in the usual ways. And for Lex Luthor, That point does not arrive as a slow change, but as a presence that seems to exist outside everything he has come to understand. A presence that moves through the world with a kind of ease that does not match the effort he has always believed is required to achieve anything of value. At first, this presence is not fully clear, not fully defined, but it begins to take shape through stories, through reports, through moments that do not fit within the systems he has studied. Moments where something happens that should not be possible, where limits are crossed without explanation, where outcomes appear without the processes that usually lead to them. Buildings are saved from collapse. Disasters are stopped before they can fully unfold. And people speak of a figure who moves faster than thought, stronger than anything they have seen, and yet carries none of the visible effort that would normally be required for such actions. This figure, who will come to be known openly as Superman, does not announce himself in the way that power often does, because there are no declarations, no demands, no clear attempts to claim authority, and yet his presence alone begins to change the way the world moves, the way people think, and the way events unfold. For many, this arrival feels like hope, like a sign that something greater is watching over them, something that can protect them from dangers they cannot face alone. And this feeling spreads quickly, shaping public thought in ways that are difficult to control. But for someone whose entire way of thinking is built on understanding systems, on knowing how outcomes are created, on believing that power must be earned, measured, and directed, this presence does not feel like hope, but like a disruption, something that does not fit within the structure he has spent so long building. Because if something can exist outside the rules, if something can act without limitation, then what does that mean for everything he has worked to create, everything he has designed to function within those rules? He does not react with visible anger, nor does he dismiss what he observes, because ignoring something does not make it disappear, and so he begins to study it, to examine every detail, every appearance, every outcome, searching for patterns, searching for explanations, searching for anything that can bring this presence back into the realm of understanding. Reports are gathered, data is analyzed, and every action taken by this figure is observed with careful attention, not out of admiration, but out of a need to define, to categorize, to bring order to something that feels deeply out of place. Yet the more he studies, the more the problem becomes clear, because this is not simply a matter of advanced ability or hidden technology. This is something fundamentally different, something that does not follow human limits, something that exists beyond the natural boundaries he has come to accept as the foundation of reality. Strength without visible strain, speed without clear cause, resilience that cannot be easily explained, and a presence that seems almost untouched by the forces that shape everything else. It is here that the deeper conflict begins to form, not in action, but in thought, because the existence of such a being raises a question that cannot be ignored, a question that touches the very core of what he believes about the world. If humanity is to grow, if it is to improve, if it is to reach its full potential, then it must do so through effort, through knowledge, through the careful building of systems that support progress. But what happens when something exists that bypasses all of that? Something that does not need to struggle, does not need to learn in the same way, does not need to earn its place? This question does not remain simple for long, because it begins to shape into something more defined, something that challenges not just his understanding, but his sense of order. Because if people begin to look to this figure for guidance, for protection, for answers, then what happens to the systems he has built? What happens to the idea that humanity must guide itself, must rely on its own strength, its own intelligence? In this way, the presence of Superman becomes more than just an unknown. It becomes a threat, not in the traditional sense of harm, but in the sense of disruption, a force that changes how people think, how they act, and how they see their own place in the world. Because if someone else can solve their problems, if someone else can protect them from danger, then the need for human growth, for human effort, begins to fade, and this is something he cannot accept. His rejection of this idea does not come from emotion alone. but from principle, from a belief that humanity must stand on its own, that it must not depend on something that exists outside its own understanding, because dependence leads to weakness, and weakness leads to failure. This belief becomes stronger with each observation, with each moment where people place their trust in something they do not fully understand, something they cannot control, something that could, at any moment, choose a different path. And so, the conflict takes shape quietly, not yet visible to the world, not yet expressed in direct action, but present in every thought, in every conclusion, in every plan that begins to form. Because for him, this is not simply about one being, but about what that being represents. The idea that power can exist without accountability, that influence can be held without being earned, and that control can be taken without being understood. This is where ambition begins to change, because it is no longer focused only on growth, on expansion, on building something greater, but begins to center on something more specific, something more urgent, the need to understand, to challenge, and eventually to overcome this presence that stands outside everything he has worked to create. What once was a broad vision becomes more focused, more directed, as if all paths now lead toward a single point, a single question that must be answered. There is no immediate action, no sudden move to confront what he has observed, because such a step would require certainty, and certainty must be built, must be supported by knowledge, by strategy, by preparation. And so, he continues to study, to observe, to learn, but now with a different purpose, not just to understand the world, but to understand this one element that does not belong to it, at least not in the way everything else does. Over time, this focus begins to shape everything else, influencing decisions, guiding efforts, and narrowing attention, until it becomes clear that this is no longer just one part of his thinking, but the center of it, the point around which everything else begins to move. What started as curiosity has become something deeper, something more persistent, something that does not fade, something that demands resolution. And yet, even as this shift takes place, it remains quiet, controlled, hidden beneath the surface of everything he continues to build, because he understands that power is not just about strength, but about timing, about knowing when to act and when to wait. And so, he waits, not passively, but actively, preparing, refining, and building toward a moment that has not yet come, but feels inevitable. In this way, the arrival of something impossible does not break him, does not stop his progress, but changes its direction, shaping it into something more focused, more determined, and more complex. Because now, there is not just a world to understand and control, but a force within that world that must be brought into that control, or removed from it entirely. And as this new direction takes hold, as thought turns steadily toward this single point, there is a quiet recognition that something has changed within him, something that will not return to what it once was. Because where there was once only ambition, there is now something stronger, something more consuming, a drive that does not rest, that does not fade, and that will continue to grow until the question it carries is answered, one way or another. Envy and stillness, the emotion he refuses to name. There are feelings that move loudly, clear and easy to name, and there are others that remain quiet, hidden beneath layers of thought, shaped and reshaped until they no longer look like what they truly are. And within the steady mind of Lex Luthor, there begins to exist a kind of stillness that is not empty, but filled with something difficult to define, something that does not show itself openly, yet continues to influence the way he sees everything around him. From the outside, nothing appears different, because his actions remain controlled, his plans remain precise, and his words remain measured. But beneath that calm surface, there is a quiet tension that does not fade, a feeling that does not fully settle no matter how much he tries to understand it through logic alone. He does not allow himself to describe this feeling in simple terms, because simple terms suggest weakness, and weakness is something he has trained himself to avoid. not by denying its existence, but by refusing to give it a form that could influence his decisions in ways he cannot control. Instead, he studies it as he would any other problem, observing how it appears, when it becomes stronger, and what thoughts seem to follow it, as if by understanding its patterns, he can reduce it to something manageable, something that can be placed within the system of his thinking and contained. This feeling often arises in moments where he observes the actions of Superman, not in the dramatic events that draw attention from the public, but in quieter observations, in the way people respond, in the way admiration spreads without effort, in the way trust is given freely without question. It is not the strength or speed that unsettles him in these moments, because those can be studied, measured, and eventually understood in some form, but the ease, the way acceptance comes without challenge, the way influence is held without the process he has always believed is necessary to earn it. He tells himself that this reaction is not emotional, that it is based on reason, on the clear understanding that such influence, when unearned, creates imbalance, and that imbalance must be corrected, not for personal reasons, but for the stability of everything else. This explanation feels logical, structured, and complete, and yet it does not fully quiet the feeling, because even as he builds arguments to support his view, there remains something underneath, something that does not fully align with the conclusions he reaches. There are moments, brief and often unacknowledged, where observation shifts into something softer, something that does not carry the weight of judgment, moments where he recognizes not just the difference, but the possibility, the idea that if such power can exist, then the boundaries he has studied may not be as fixed as they seem. And this thought, though small, carries with it a sense of wonder that he does not allow to grow, because wonder leads to acceptance, and acceptance leads to surrender, and surrender is something he cannot allow, not within himself, not within the system he has built so carefully. And so, admiration begins to form, not as something he welcomes, but as something he notices, and immediately begins to reshape, to analyze, to reduce into parts that can be explained away, to turn something emotional into something intellectual. He sees the discipline required to act consistently, the restraint shown in moments where power could easily be used differently, and the way decisions are made in ways that protect rather than dominate. And while these observations could lead to respect, he redirects them, placing them within a framework that allows him to maintain distance, to keep the structure of his thinking intact. At the same time, there is another reaction that grows alongside this one, something sharper, something more defined, something that does not seek to understand, but to challenge. And this is where resentment begins to take shape, not as anger, but as a response to imbalance, as a reaction to the idea that one being can stand above systems that others must work within. This resentment is not loud, not uncontrolled, but steady, built from repeated observation, from patterns that do not change, from outcomes that continue to confirm the same conclusion. What makes this internal state complex is not the presence of these feelings alone, but the way they exist together, the way admiration and resentment do not cancel each other out, but instead create a kind of tension that remains unresolved, a quiet conflict that does not reach the surface, but continues to influence thought and perception. He does not allow himself to accept this contradiction openly, because doing so would require acknowledging that his understanding is not complete, that his system does not account for everything, and this is something he resists. Instead, he refines his reasoning, adjusts his perspective, and strengthens the arguments that support his conclusions, focusing on the risks, the uncertainties, and the potential consequences of allowing such power to remain unchecked. He frames his thoughts in terms of responsibility, of necessity, of the need to protect humanity from dependence, and in doing so, he creates a narrative that aligns with his values, a narrative that supports his actions, and a narrative that allows him to move forward without confronting the deeper layers of what he feels. Yet even within this carefully constructed reasoning, there are moments where the stillness returns, where thought slows just enough for the underlying tension to be noticed again, where the question arises, quietly and without demand, whether what he is responding to is truly only about logic, or whether there is something more personal, something tied not just to systems and balance, but to the idea of being surpassed, of existing in a world where someone else holds a position that cannot be reached through the methods he has always trusted. This question does not remain for long, because he does not allow it to. He redirects it, reshapes it, and moves forward, returning to the structure that has always guided him, because within that structure, there is certainty, there is control, and there is direction. But the presence of the question itself leaves a trace, a small shift that does not disappear, a quiet awareness that something within him is not as simple as he would prefer it to be. Over time, this internal balance becomes part of how he functions, part of how he processes everything related to the figure he studies so closely, creating a pattern where observation leads to analysis, analysis leads to conclusion, and conclusion reinforces belief, even as the underlying tension remains. It does not weaken him, but it shapes him, adds depth to his thinking, and influences the direction of his focus in ways that are not always visible from the outside. In this way, the emotion he refuses to name does not disappear, but becomes integrated, absorbed into the system he has built, where it exists not as a separate force, but as a hidden layer, influencing without being acknowledged, guiding without being openly recognized. It is both a source of clarity and a source of distortion, pushing him to examine more deeply, to question more intensely, and to act with greater precision, while also narrowing his perspective, focusing it on a single point that continues to grow in importance. And as this process continues, as admiration remains unspoken and resentment remains justified, the distance between what he believes and what he feels does not close, but stretches, creating a space where both can exist without resolution, where both can shape his path without ever being fully brought into the light. This space becomes part of who he is, part of how he sees the world, and part of the reason why his actions will continue to move in a direction that feels both inevitable and deeply personal, even if he never allows himself to say so. War without noise, strategy over strength. There are conflicts that arrive with noise, with bright flashes and sudden impact, where force is seen and measured in the moment. And then there are conflicts that unfold without sound, without movement that can be easily noticed, where the outcome is decided long before anyone realizes a contest has even begun. And it is within this quieter kind of struggle that Lex Luthor feels most at home, because for him, power is not something to display, but something to design, something to guide from a distance, something that shapes results without drawing attention to the process that created them. He does not step forward to meet strength with strength, because he understands that such a path would place him within a system he did not create, a system where outcomes are decided by limits he does not control, and instead, he chooses a different approach, one that begins not with action, but with observation, with the careful study of patterns, of behaviors, of reactions that repeat over time. In this way, he treats conflict not as a sudden event, but as something that can be mapped, something that can be predicted, and eventually, something that can be directed toward a desired outcome. When he looks at the world around him, he does not see isolated moments, but connected systems, where each decision leads to another, where each action creates a response, and where those responses can be studied and used to build a larger plan. This way of thinking allows him to move without being seen, not in a physical sense, but in the way his influence spreads through structures that already exist, through organizations, through people, through choices that appear natural but are guided by forces that are not immediately visible. There is a patience in this approach that others might find difficult to understand, because it requires waiting, requires allowing events to unfold in ways that may not seem beneficial at first, but that serve a larger purpose when viewed over time. He does not rush toward results, because rushed results can be unstable, and instability creates risk, and risk is something he works carefully to reduce. Instead, he builds slowly, placing each part where it will have the greatest effect, ensuring that when the outcome arrives, it feels not sudden, but inevitable. In this quiet process, manipulation becomes a tool, not used with open force, but with subtle direction, where choices are influenced rather than controlled directly, where people believe they are acting on their own decisions, while those decisions have already been shaped by information, by circumstance, by the careful arrangement of options that lead toward a specific path. This does not require deception in the simple sense, but rather an understanding of how people think, how they respond to pressure, how they react to opportunity, and how these reactions can be guided without being forced. He studies individuals as he studies systems, recognizing patterns in behavior, identifying strengths and weaknesses, and using this knowledge to place them in positions where their actions contribute to the larger plan. Some are motivated by ambition, others by fear, others by loyalty or belief. And by understanding these motivations, he can influence outcomes without needing to be present at every moment. Because once a system is properly arranged, it begins to function on its own, moving toward the result it was designed to achieve. At the center of this approach is the belief that control does not require constant action, but rather careful design, where the initial effort creates a structure that continues to operate without continuous input, much like a machine that, once built and set in motion, carries out its function with consistency. This allows him to focus not on individual events, but on the larger picture, on the long-term direction of the systems he has created, ensuring that each part continues to move in alignment with his goals. This kind of conflict does not draw attention, because there are no clear moments where a battle can be identified, no single event that marks the beginning or end, but rather a series of small shifts that, over time, create significant change. A company alters its direction, a policy is influenced, a decision is made that affects thousands without them ever knowing the source of that influence. And each of these moments becomes part of a larger process that remains mostly invisible to those who are not looking for it. In contrast to visible power, which can be challenged, resisted, or even defeated, this quieter form of influence is more difficult to confront because it does not present a clear target, does not offer a single point where it can be opposed, and instead exists within the systems themselves, woven into the structure in a way that makes it part of how things function. This is where he holds his advantage, not in strength, but in understanding, not in force, but in design. Even when considering the presence of Superman, whose abilities exist far beyond what can be matched directly, he does not seek to confront that power in a way that would place him at a disadvantage, but instead looks for ways to shift the conditions around it, to create situations where strength alone is not enough, where decisions must be made, where consequences must be considered, where even the greatest power must operate within a framework that can be influenced. This does not happen through a single plan, but through many, each one connected to the next, forming a network of strategies that adapt as new information becomes available, that change direction when needed, and that continue to move forward even when individual parts fail. Failure, in this system, is not an end, but a point of data, something to be studied and used to refine the next approach, ensuring that each attempt becomes more precise, more effective, and more aligned with the final goal. There is a certain calm in this method, a sense that conflict does not need to be loud to be meaningful, that victory does not need to be visible to be real, and that the most powerful changes are often those that happen without announcement, without recognition, without anyone realizing that the outcome was shaped long before it appeared. This calm is not passive, but active, a steady focus that does not waver, that does not seek attention, but seeks results. Over time, this way of operating becomes not just a strategy, but a defining feature of how he interacts with the world, shaping every decision, guiding every action, and influencing every plan. It allows him to engage in conflicts that others may not even notice, to win battles that are never named, and to shape outcomes that appear natural, even when they are carefully constructed. And within this quiet war, where noise is replaced by thought and force is replaced by design, there is a sense of control that does not rely on dominance, but on understanding, on the ability to see the connections between events, to anticipate reactions, and to guide systems toward a desired state without needing to stand at the center of every moment. This control is not absolute, but it is consistent, growing stronger with each success, with each refinement, with each step taken in alignment with the larger vision. As this process continues, as plans extend further into the future and influence spreads more deeply into the structures of the world, the nature of conflict itself begins to change, becoming less about immediate outcomes and more about long-term direction, less about individual victories and more about sustained control. In this space, where battles are fought without being seen and decisions are made without being traced, he finds not just effectiveness, but certainty, a belief that this is the most reliable path, the most stable approach, and the one most aligned with his understanding of how power should be used. Because in the end, for Lex Luthor, strength that can be seen is strength that can be challenged, but influence that moves through systems, through people, and through time itself becomes something far more difficult to resist, something that does not need to prove itself in a single moment, because its presence is felt in every outcome it shapes, quietly, steadily, and without the need for recognition. The mask of respectability, hero, philanthropist, tyrant. In a city that measures worth by what can be seen and felt in everyday life, reputation becomes a kind of currency that moves quietly between people, shaping how they speak, how they trust, and how they decide who deserves to be followed. And within this space, Lex Luthor begins to build something that cannot be touched like a building or counted like wealth, yet carries a weight that can guide entire crowds without them noticing where the direction comes from. It does not appear suddenly, because trust rarely does, but grows through repeated moments, through visible acts that seem to align with the needs of others, through gestures that appear generous, thoughtful, and timed in a way that feels almost natural, as if they were always meant to happen. Hospitals receive funding that allows them to expand their reach. Research centers are given resources to explore ideas that promise to improve lives. Schools are supported in ways that make education more accessible. And public spaces are improved so that people can feel a sense of pride in the place they call home. These actions are seen, talked about, and remembered, not just because of their scale, but because of how they are presented, not as transactions, but as contributions, not as strategies, but as care. And as these efforts continue, a story begins to form, one that people repeat without needing to be told. A story that describes a man who gives back, who supports progress, who stands as a protector of human advancement. This story becomes part of how he is understood, part of how his presence is interpreted, and over time, it shapes expectations, creating a sense that when challenges arise, when uncertainty grows, there is someone who will step forward, someone who will provide direction, someone who can be trusted to act in the best interest of others. This trust is not demanded, but earned through consistency, through actions that appear to match words, through results that seem to confirm intention. And in this way, the image of a benefactor, of a figure who serves the greater good, becomes firmly established. Yet behind this image, there is another layer, one that is not visible in the same way, one that does not appear in public statements or carefully chosen moments, but exists within the decisions that guide those actions, within the reasons behind them, within the structure that determines not just what is done, but why it is done and what it leads to over time. Because for him, every act, no matter how generous it appears, is part of a larger system, a network of influence that connects one outcome to another, that ensures that each contribution strengthens not just the community, but his position within it. This does not make the actions themselves less real, because the hospitals do expand, the research does continue, and the lives of people are improved in ways that cannot be denied. But it does change how those actions are understood when viewed from a deeper perspective, because they are not only about helping, but about guiding, not only about giving, but about shaping how people think, how they respond, and how they place their trust. In this sense, kindness becomes part of a design, a tool that can be used to build connection, to create loyalty, and to influence perception without needing to force it. There is a careful balance in how this is maintained, because too much visibility can raise questions, while too little can weaken the image, and so each step is measured, each action considered not just for its immediate effect, but for how it fits into the larger picture, how it reinforces the narrative that has been created, how it strengthens the belief that he is a force for good, a figure who stands on the side of progress, a person who acts with purpose and care. At the same time, there are decisions made in quieter spaces, decisions that do not reach the public in the same way, decisions that shape industries, influence policies, and guide outcomes that affect many people without being directly connected to a visible act of generosity. These decisions are not random, but calculated, aligned with the same system that supports the public image, ensuring that everything moves in a direction that supports his vision, even when that direction is not fully understood by those who are affected by it. This creates a duality that is difficult to see from the outside, because both sides exist at the same time, both are real, and both contribute to the overall picture. On one side, there is the visible presence of someone who supports growth, who invests in the future, who appears to care deeply about the well-being of others. And on the other side, there is the structure of control, the careful arrangement of systems that guide outcomes, that shape decisions, and that ensure that influence remains centered where it can be most effective. For many, these two sides do not appear to conflict, because the results they see are positive, because the improvements in their lives feel real, and because the idea that these actions might serve a larger purpose beyond what is visible does not naturally come to mind. Trust, once established, has a way of smoothing over questions, of reducing the need to look deeper, and in this space, perception becomes stronger than investigation. Belief becomes stronger than doubt. There are moments, however, where this balance becomes more complex, where the connection between action and intention becomes less clear, where decisions made in the background begin to have effects that are not immediately understood, and in these moments, the difference between what is seen and what is true becomes more important. But even then, the strength of the image often remains, because it has been built over time, reinforced through consistency, and supported by outcomes that cannot be easily dismissed. What makes this structure so effective is not just the actions themselves, but the understanding of how people respond to them, the knowledge that kindness can create trust, that trust can create influence, and that influence can guide decisions in ways that do not require force. In this way, power takes on a different form, one that does not need to be declared, one that does not rely on visible authority, but one that exists within the connections between people, within the beliefs they hold, and within the choices they make based on those beliefs. From his perspective, this approach is not deceptive, but practical, a way of aligning outcomes with intention, a method of ensuring that progress moves in a direction that is structured, controlled, and guided by understanding rather than chance. He does not see the duality as a contradiction, but as a necessity, because the world, as he understands it, requires both visible leadership and unseen guidance, both public trust and private control. And so, the mask of respectability is not something that is worn and removed, but something that becomes part of the structure itself, integrated into how he operates, how he is seen, and how he shapes the world around him. It allows him to move freely within spaces that might otherwise resist him, to influence without being challenged, and to build systems that support his vision while appearing to serve a broader purpose. In this way, the idea of being a hero, a philanthropist, or even something more controlling does not exist as separate identities, but as parts of a single approach, different expressions of the same underlying belief that the world can and should be guided, that progress must be directed, and that those who have the ability to shape outcomes carry a responsibility to do so, even if the methods they use are not fully visible to those they affect. As the city continues to grow and change, as new challenges appear and old ones evolve, this balance remains, shifting as needed, adapting to new circumstances, but always maintaining the connection between perception and control, between what is seen and what is designed. And within this structure, the line between kindness and strategy becomes less clear, not because one replaces the other, but because they begin to function together, creating a form of power that is both accepted and unquestioned, both visible and hidden, and most importantly, deeply effective in shaping the world as he believes it should be. The presidency of control. When power becomes law, there are moments in history when influence gathers so much weight that it begins to change form, shifting from something that moves behind the scenes into something that stands at the center of attention, not hidden within systems, but placed above them, where decisions are no longer guided quietly, but declared openly. And for Lex Luthor, this shift does not come as a surprise, but as a continuation of everything that has been built before, a natural step where influence becomes authority, and authority becomes something that can shape not just outcomes, but the rules that create those outcomes. The path toward political power is not rushed, because rushing would risk instability, and instability weakens structure, and so each step is taken with care, with attention to timing, to public perception, to the way people respond to leadership when it is presented not as control, but as necessity. The image that has been built over time, the reputation for progress, for support, for visible improvement, becomes a foundation that allows this transition to appear not as ambition, but as service, not as a desire to rule, but as a willingness to guide when others cannot. Campaigns are shaped not just by promises, but by patterns, by understanding what people fear, what they hope for, what they believe is missing, and by aligning these concerns with solutions that feel practical, achievable, and immediate. Words are chosen carefully, not to deceive, but to connect, to create a sense that leadership is not distant, but present, not abstract, but real. In this space, trust becomes the key that opens the door. And once that door is opened, influence can move through it in ways that extend far beyond what is visible. When authority is finally gained, it does not arrive as a single moment of victory, but as the beginning of a new kind of structure, one where decisions are no longer suggestions or influences, but laws, where ideas are no longer proposals, but directives that shape the daily lives of millions. This shift changes the nature of power itself, because it moves from guiding systems to becoming the system, from shaping outcomes to defining the rules by which outcomes are created. Within this new position, the world begins to look different, not because it has changed completely, but because the perspective from which it is viewed has expanded, reaching beyond the boundaries of a single city into a network of connections that stretch across nations, economies, and cultures. Information flows from many sources. Decisions ripple outward in ways that affect people who will never see the face behind those decisions. And responsibility grows, not just in scale, but in complexity. There is a sense of order that begins to take shape, one that appears strong, consistent, and reliable, because systems are aligned, policies are directed with purpose, and actions are taken with a clear understanding of their intended effects. From the outside, this order feels stable, like a structure that holds firm against uncertainty, like a system that has been carefully designed to reduce risk and increase efficiency. People begin to feel that things are moving in the right direction, that progress is being managed, that the future is becoming more predictable. Yet beneath this sense of stability, there is another layer, one that is not immediately visible, one that exists within the decisions that shape this order, within the priorities, that determine which problems are addressed and which are set aside, within the beliefs that guide how solutions are chosen. Because while the system appears balanced, it is built on a specific way of thinking, a perspective that has been developed over time, shaped by experience, by study, and by a belief in how the world should function. This is where the merging begins, not as a sudden change, but as a gradual alignment between governance and personal ideology, where the rules that guide society begin to reflect the values of the one who creates them, where policies are not just responses to problems, but expressions of a deeper belief about control, about progress, about what is necessary for stability to be maintained. This merging does not appear as conflict, because it is consistent. It follows a logic that seems clear and structured, and it produces results that can be measured and observed. However, what makes this structure complex is the idea of illusion, not in the sense of something false, but in the sense of something that appears complete while hiding its limitations. The order that is created feels strong, but it is shaped by a single perspective, guided by a single vision, and while that vision may be effective, it does not account for every possibility, every difference, every way of thinking that exists within a diverse world. Yet, because the system functions well, because it produces results, this limitation is not immediately visible, and so the illusion remains intact. Decisions are made with precision, based on data, on analysis, on understanding of systems, and this creates a sense that everything is under control, that uncertainty is being reduced, that chaos is being replaced with structure. But within this process, there is less room for unpredictability, less space for variation, less acceptance of outcomes that do not align with the intended direction, and this begins to shape the environment in subtle ways, influencing not just what happens, but what is allowed to happen. In this way, governance becomes more than just a role. It becomes an extension of thought, a way of applying ideas on a scale that reaches beyond individual systems into the framework of society itself. Laws are not just rules, but tools, mechanisms through which direction is applied, through which behavior is guided, through which outcomes are shaped over time. This does not happen with force, but with structure, with systems that encourage certain actions while discouraging others, creating a path that feels natural to those who follow it. From his perspective, this approach is not about control for its own sake, but about creating stability, about ensuring that progress does not fall apart, about guiding humanity toward a future that is stronger, more organized, and less vulnerable to failure. This belief reinforces every decision, supports every policy, and shapes every action, creating a consistency that makes the system appear reliable and trustworthy. At the same time, this consistency begins to limit alternatives, because when a system is designed to function in a specific way, it becomes harder for other ways of thinking to exist within it, harder for different approaches to take shape. And while this may not be immediately noticeable, it becomes part of how the system operates, part of how it maintains its order. This is where the idea of control becomes more complex, because it is no longer just about guiding outcomes, but about defining the space in which outcomes can occur. As global influence grows, as connections extend across borders, as decisions begin to affect not just one nation but many, the scale of this structure increases, and with it, the impact of each choice. Trade, technology, security, and communication all become part of a larger network, one that must be managed with care, one that requires constant attention, constant adjustment, and constant awareness of how changes in one area affect others. In this expanding system, there is little room for hesitation, because delay can create instability, and instability can spread quickly when systems are connected. And so decisions continue to be made with confidence, with direction, with a belief that the path being followed is not only effective, but necessary. This belief becomes the foundation upon which everything rests, the reason why the system continues to move forward, the reason why control is maintained even as complexity increases. And yet, within all of this, there remains a quiet question, one that does not disrupt the system, but exists alongside it. A question about whether true order can ever be complete when shaped by a single vision, whether stability can remain strong when it depends on one source of direction, and whether the balance between guidance and freedom can be maintained as control becomes more deeply embedded within the structure. This question does not stop the process, does not change the direction, but it exists, like a distant thought that does not fully fade, reminding that even the most carefully designed systems carry within them the possibility of change, the possibility of challenge, and the possibility that no structure, no matter how strong, is entirely beyond the reach of forces that cannot be fully predicted. And so, as authority becomes law, as influence becomes governance, and as vision becomes reality on a scale that touches millions, the system continues to grow, continues to evolve, and continues to move forward, shaped by a belief that control, when applied with understanding, can create a world that is stronger, more stable, and more aligned with the direction it has been given, even if that direction comes from a single mind that sees itself not just as a leader, but as the one best suited to guide everything that follows. The fear of irrelevance, a man against time. Time does not arrive with noise, and it does not ask permission before it begins to change everything, because it moves quietly through every plan, through every structure, through every idea that once felt permanent. And for Lex Luthor, whose life has been shaped by control, by precision, and by the belief that systems can be designed to resist failure, the presence of time becomes something that cannot be ignored, something that cannot be fully measured, and something that cannot be directed in the same way as everything else he has mastered. At first, this awareness does not appear as fear, because fear suggests a loss of control, and control is something he has always worked to maintain, and so it begins as observation, as a recognition of small changes that most people might overlook, changes that do not seem important on their own, but when seen together, form a pattern that cannot be dismissed. Energy that once felt endless begins to require more effort. Moments of pause become slightly longer, and the distance between decisions and action becomes just enough to notice, just enough to remind him that even the most disciplined mind exists within a body that follows its own limits. These limits are not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady, consistent, and impossible to fully reverse, and this creates a kind of tension that is different from anything he has faced before. Because it is not a problem that can be solved through analysis alone, not a system that can be adjusted with the right input, but a condition that exists beyond his influence, a boundary that does not respond to strategy in the same way as everything else. He studies it as he studies everything, searching for patterns, for methods, for ways to extend what he has built beyond the constraints of time. Because if control is to remain, then it must find a way to exist even when the one who created it is no longer present in the same way. This leads to a deeper focus on legacy, not as a concept of memory or recognition, but as a continuation of influence, a system that can operate without direct oversight, a structure that can maintain its direction even as time continues to move forward. The idea of being forgotten does not present itself as a simple concern, but as a question of permanence, of whether anything built, no matter how powerful, can truly last, and whether the systems he has created are strong enough to continue without him, or whether they will change, shift, or even collapse once the source of their design is removed. This question does not have an immediate answer, and that lack of certainty creates a space that feels unfamiliar, because it is not based on lack of knowledge, but on the nature of time itself. There are moments where he observes the world continuing without pause, where new figures rise, where ideas change, where systems evolve in ways that do not always follow the original design. And in these moments, there is a quiet realization that influence, no matter how strong, exists within a larger flow, one that cannot be fully stopped, one that cannot be completely controlled. This realization does not weaken his resolve, but it changes the way he thinks about control, shifting it from something that exists in the present to something that must extend into the future in a way that is not dependent on his direct presence. This shift leads to new strategies, new methods, new ways of ensuring that his influence remains, not just through systems, but through ideas, through structures that are designed to adapt, to continue, to evolve, while maintaining the core principles that define them. He begins to think not just in terms of outcomes, but in terms of continuity, of how each decision contributes to a future that may exist beyond his ability to directly shape it. At the same time, there is a subtle change in how he perceives those around him, because where there was once a clear separation based on understanding and control, there is now an awareness that everyone exists within the same flow of time, that no one, no matter how powerful or intelligent, is entirely outside its reach. This does not create equality in the way most would define it, but it introduces a shared condition, a common limitation that cannot be ignored. He does not express this awareness openly, because doing so would suggest acceptance, and acceptance implies surrender, and surrender is not something he allows within his thinking. Instead, he maintains his composure, continues his work, and presents the same level of confidence, the same level of control, ensuring that nothing in his outward behavior reflects the complexity of what he is considering internally. Yet beneath this composed exterior, there is a growing urgency, not visible in sudden actions, but present in the pace of decisions, in the focus on ensuring that systems are reinforced, that structures are strengthened, that influence is secured in ways that do not rely on immediate presence. This urgency is not chaotic, but controlled, shaped by the same logic that has guided him throughout his life, but now directed toward a different kind of challenge, one that cannot be approached in the same way as before. The idea that intellect alone may not be enough to overcome time becomes clearer, not as a failure, but as a limitation. And this realization forces a kind of adaptation, a recognition that while knowledge can extend influence, it cannot stop the movement of time itself. And so the focus shifts from overcoming to outlasting, from controlling every moment to ensuring that the overall direction remains intact. This creates a deeper level of planning, one that considers not just immediate outcomes, but long-term stability, not just visible success, but lasting impact. And in this process, every decision carries additional weight, because it is no longer just about what happens now, but about what will continue when direct control is no longer possible. This perspective does not slow him down, but intensifies his focus, making each action more deliberate, more precise, more aligned with the idea of permanence. At times, there is a quiet reflection on what it means to leave something behind, not in terms of recognition or praise, but in terms of structure, of whether the systems created will continue to function as intended, whether they will hold their form, or whether they will change under the influence of others who may not share the same vision. This reflection does not lead to hesitation, but to reinforcement, to strengthening the connections that hold everything together, to ensuring that the foundation is as strong as possible. The fear that exists within this process is not loud, not overwhelming, but present, like a distant pressure that does not fade, a reminder that no matter how much control is achieved, there is always something beyond it, something that cannot be fully shaped or directed. This fear is not allowed to grow unchecked, because it is contained within the same system of thought that has guided everything else, analyzed, understood, and placed within a structure that allows it to exist without disrupting the overall direction. And so, the man who has built his life on control, on knowledge, and on the belief that systems can be perfected, continues to move forward, not by denying the presence of time, but by adapting to it, by finding ways to extend his influence beyond the limits it imposes, by ensuring that what he has created does not fade easily, even as the world continues to change. In this way, the struggle against time does not become a battle that can be won, but a condition that must be navigated, a force that shapes decisions in ways that are not always visible, but always present. guiding the direction of thought, influencing the pace of action, and reminding that even the most powerful structures exist within a reality that cannot be fully controlled. And within this quiet understanding, there is a continued determination, not to defeat time, but to leave behind something that endures, something that continues to move forward, something that reflects the clarity of his vision even when he is no longer there to guide it directly. A legacy not of memory, but of influence, designed to persist, to adapt, and to remain, even as everything else continues to change. Reflections in Steel, seeing himself in Superman. There are times when a person looks outward and believes they are studying something completely separate from themselves, something distant, something that can be measured and understood without personal involvement. And yet, slowly, almost without noticing, that same person begins to see traces of themselves within what they observe, not in appearance, not in origin, but in the deeper patterns of thought, in the choices that define action, in the quiet reasons that guide what is done and what is avoided. For Lex Luthor, this kind of reflection does not arrive as a moment of clarity, but as a series of observations that begin to connect over time, forming a picture that is both familiar and deeply uncomfortable. He has spent years studying the presence of Superman, breaking down actions into patterns, patterns into conclusions, and conclusions into plans, always maintaining the distance that allows him to treat the subject as something external, something that can be analyzed without influence from personal feeling. Yet, as the observations grow, as the patterns become clearer, there begins to appear something unexpected, something that does not fit within the original framework, something that suggests a connection rather than a separation. It begins with the recognition of discipline, not in the physical sense alone, but in the consistency of action, in the way decisions are made not based on impulse, but on a steady internal guide that does not shift easily. This kind of discipline is something he understands well, something he has built within himself over time, and seeing it reflected in another, even in a different form, creates a moment of pause, a brief interruption in the process of analysis, where comparison begins to take shape. There is also the matter of purpose, because both operate with a clear sense of direction, a belief that their actions serve something larger than themselves, even if the nature of that purpose differs greatly. For him, purpose is tied to structure, to order, to the idea that the world must be shaped to prevent failure, while, for the one he observes, purpose appears to be tied to protection, to the idea that strength exists to shield others from harm. These differences are clear, and yet the presence of purpose itself creates a connection, a shared foundation that cannot be ignored. This is where the reflection becomes more complex, because it raises a question that goes beyond simple comparison, a question about what defines humanity, about whether it is origin, ability, or choice that determines who someone truly is. If one being is not born in the same way, does not share the same limits, and yet chooses to act in ways that protect others, does that make them less human? Or does it challenge the definition itself, suggesting that humanity is not tied to physical form, but to the decisions that shape behavior? He does not accept this question easily, because accepting it would require a shift in perspective, a willingness to reconsider beliefs that have been built carefully over time. And so he approaches it as he approaches everything else, through analysis, through reasoning, through the careful separation of factors that can be examined individually. He considers the nature of choice, the influence of environment, the role of power in shaping behavior, and in doing so, he seeks to create a clear boundary, a way to define humanity in terms that align with his understanding. Yet the more he examines, the more that boundary begins to blur, because the actions he observes do not fit neatly into the categories he has created. There are moments where restraint is shown despite overwhelming strength, where compassion guides decisions that could easily be driven by efficiency, where the protection of others takes priority over personal gain, and these moments do not align with the idea of a being that exists outside humanity in a purely detached way. Instead, they suggest a connection a shared element that is not based on origin, but on choice. This realization does not lead to acceptance, but to tension, because it challenges the structure of his thinking, introduces uncertainty into a system that relies on clarity, and forces him to confront the possibility that what he has defined as different may not be as separate as he once believed. He responds by strengthening his reasoning, by focusing on the differences, by emphasizing the risks, the unknown factors, the potential consequences of allowing such power to exist without complete understanding or control. At the same time, there is a deeper layer to this reflection, one that goes beyond comparison and into the realm of possibility, because in observing the choices made by the one he studies, he is not only seeing another path, but a version of what could exist, a version of power that operates under a different set of principles, a version of influence that does not seek to control in the same way. This possibility does not feel comfortable because it suggests that there is more than one way to shape the world, more than one way to guide outcomes, and that his approach, while effective, may not be the only path. This idea creates a kind of internal resistance, not expressed openly, but present in the way he continues to analyze, to challenge, to question the validity of what he observes, searching for flaws, for inconsistencies, for anything that can reaffirm his belief that his approach is the correct one. He looks for moments where decisions could have been made differently, where outcomes could have been improved through more direct control, where reliance on strength rather than structure creates vulnerability. And yet, even in this search, there are moments where the effectiveness of a different approach becomes clear, where outcomes are achieved not through control, but through trust, not through direction, but through example. And these moments do not fit easily into his framework. They do not replace his beliefs, but they exist alongside them, creating a space where certainty is not as complete as it once was. In this space, the nature of the conflict begins to change, because it is no longer just about opposing a figure, no longer just about addressing a threat to order, but about confronting a possibility, a different way of thinking, a different way of using power, a different definition of what it means to lead. This possibility does not weaken his resolve, but it deepens the conflict, making it more personal, more complex, because it is no longer just external, but internal as well. He does not frame this conflict in emotional terms, does not allow himself to describe it as anything other than a matter of logic, of necessity, of ensuring that the world follows a path that leads to stability. But beneath this framing, there is an awareness that what he is opposing is not just a presence, but an idea that challenges his own, an idea that suggests that control may not be the only way to achieve progress. This awareness does not lead to change, but to reinforcement, to a stronger commitment to his path, to a deeper focus on proving that his approach is not only valid, but superior. And this focus shapes everything that follows, guiding decisions, influencing plans, and narrowing attention toward a single point where these two perspectives meet. In this way, the reflection does not soften the conflict, but intensifies it, because it transforms it from a simple opposition into a comparison of ideals, a question of which path leads to a better outcome, which definition of humanity holds stronger, which approach to power creates a more stable world. This question does not have an immediate answer, and so it remains present in every observation, in every analysis, in every plan that continues to develop. And as this process continues, as the lines between self and other become both clearer and more blurred at the same time, there is a growing understanding that the struggle ahead is not just about defeating a rival, but about defining what the world should become, about choosing which version of possibility will shape the future, and about proving, not just to others, but to himself, that the path he has chosen is the one that must prevail. The breaking point, when control begins to slip. There are times when a structure seems so complete, so carefully arranged, that it feels as though nothing could disturb it, as though every possible weakness has already been considered and removed. And for Lex Luthor, this sense of completeness has guided him for a long time, shaping his belief that with enough preparation, enough knowledge, and enough precision, any outcome can be directed toward a desired result. Yet even the most carefully built systems exist within a world that does not always follow design. And when that world begins to move in ways that do not align with expectation, the first signs of strain do not appear as collapse, but as small disruptions, moments that do not fit, outcomes that resist control, and patterns that refuse to settle into the structure that was meant to contain them. At first, these moments are treated as anomalies, as isolated events that can be studied, understood, and corrected, because that is how he has always approached difficulty, by breaking it down, by finding the cause, and by adjusting the system to prevent it from happening again. But as time passes, these disruptions do not disappear, and instead, they begin to repeat, not always in the same way, not always in the same place, but often enough to suggest that something deeper is at work, something that cannot be easily reduced to a single explanation. There are plans that do not unfold as intended, not because they were poorly designed, but because variables that were once predictable begin to change, because people act in ways that are not fully consistent, because circumstances shift in directions that cannot be fully anticipated. Each of these moments creates a small fracture in the sense of certainty, a reminder that even the most refined systems exist within a reality that carries elements of unpredictability. He responds as he always has, with analysis, with adjustment, with a renewed focus on identifying the cause and refining the approach. And for a time, this continues to work, restoring order, bringing outcomes back into alignment, reinforcing the belief that control can be maintained with enough effort. But beneath this process, something begins to shift, not in the structure itself, but in the confidence placed within it. Because the need for constant correction suggests that the system is not as stable as it once appeared, that it requires more effort to maintain than was originally believed. There are also moments where the presence of Superman intersects with these disruptions, moments where plans are altered not by chance, but by intervention, where outcomes change in ways that cannot be fully accounted for within the existing framework. These moments do not follow the patterns that can be easily mapped, and their impact is not always immediate, but their influence is clear, creating results that stand outside the expected flow of events. In these instances, the challenge is not just practical, but conceptual, because it introduces a factor that does not respond to the same methods, a presence that cannot be guided in the same way as systems or individuals. And this creates a kind of resistance within the structure, a point where control does not extend as far as it was intended to. He studies these moments carefully, searching for ways to incorporate them into his understanding, to find a method of influence that can account for this difference. But each attempt reveals the same difficulty, the same limitation. As these challenges accumulate, the pressure within the system begins to build, not visibly, but internally, creating a tension between what is expected and what occurs, between the belief in control and the reality of its limits. This tension does not lead to immediate change, but it creates a space where certainty begins to weaken, where the idea of absolute control becomes harder to maintain without question. There are moments, brief and often unacknowledged, where emotion begins to surface, not as a clear expression, but as a shift in response, where reactions become sharper, where decisions are made with a sense of urgency that goes beyond calculated reasoning. These moments are not constant, but they are noticeable because they stand apart from the usual pattern of thought, introducing an element that does not fully align with the structure he has built. He recognizes these moments and works to contain them, to bring them back under control, to return to the steady process that has guided him for so long. But the fact that they appear at all introduces a new layer of complexity, because it suggests that not everything within him can be fully managed, that there are forces, both external and internal, that do not respond completely to logic. This realization does not lead to surrender, but to a deeper effort to reinforce the system, to strengthen the areas where it shows weakness, to eliminate variables where possible, and to create new layers of control that can compensate for what has been revealed. Yet, even as this effort continues, there is an awareness that the system is becoming more complex, more demanding, requiring more attention to maintain the same level of stability that once felt natural. The idea of superiority, which has been built on consistent success, on the ability to predict and direct outcomes, begins to face challenge, not through a single failure, but through the accumulation of moments where outcomes do not align perfectly, where control is not absolute, and where the presence of unpredictability cannot be fully removed. This challenge does not erase the belief, but it reshapes it, introducing doubt not as a dominant force, but as a subtle influence that cannot be entirely dismissed. In this state, the illusion of perfection begins to show its edges, not breaking completely, but revealing that it is not as solid as it once appeared, that beneath the appearance of control, there are elements that remain outside its reach. This does not diminish the strength of the system, but it changes how it is understood, shifting it from something that can achieve complete control to something that can achieve significant influence, but not total certainty. There are moments of reflection where this understanding becomes clearer, where the limitations are seen not as failures of effort, but as characteristics of the world itself, a world that cannot be fully contained within any system, no matter how well designed. These moments do not last long, because they do not align with the direction he has chosen, but they leave an impression, a quiet acknowledgement that control, while powerful, has boundaries. He continues to move forward, continues to plan, to build, to refine, because stopping is not an option, and because the presence of limitation does not remove the value of effort, but it changes the approach, making it more cautious, more aware, more focused on managing uncertainty rather than eliminating it entirely. In this way, the breaking point is not a single event, not a moment where everything collapses, but a gradual shift, a change in understanding that unfolds over time, revealing the fragility beneath the surface, the areas where control does not reach as far as intended, and the places where unpredictability remains. And within this shift, there is a new kind of challenge, one that does not come from external opposition alone, but from the need to reconcile belief with reality, to maintain direction while acknowledging limitation, and to continue building within a world that cannot be fully shaped, even by the most determined and capable mind. This challenge does not end the journey, but deepens it, adding layers of complexity, introducing new questions, and shaping the path forward in ways that are less certain, but no less deliberate. As he continues to move through a world that does not always follow design, carrying with him both the strength of his system and the awareness of its limits. Legacy of influence, a mind that shapes the world. There are forms of power that can be pointed to and measured, moments where victory is clear and defeat is just as visible. And then there are forms of power that do not stay in a single place, that do not depend on one event, but move quietly through people, through ideas, and through systems, shaping outcomes long after the original action has passed. And it is within this quieter space that Lex Luthor begins to understand that the most lasting impact is not always tied to direct control, but to influence that continues, even when it is no longer being actively directed. He has already seen how systems can be built, how they can guide behavior, how they can shape decisions in ways that feel natural to those within them. And now, the focus begins to expand beyond immediate results into something that stretches further into time, into the idea that influence, when designed carefully, does not end with a single outcome, but continues to move, to adapt, and to grow within the structures it has touched. This is not about winning in a single moment, but about creating conditions where the direction of progress remains aligned with a vision, even when that vision is no longer being directly enforced. In this way, the concept of legacy begins to take shape, not as a simple record of achievements, but as a living structure, something that exists within the world as a result of repeated actions, repeated decisions, and repeated patterns that have been established over time. This structure is not visible in the same way as a building or a title, but it can be felt in the way systems operate, in the way people think, and in the way decisions are made, even when the source of that influence is not immediately recognized. He begins to observe how ideas spread, how they move from one person to another, how they become part of conversations, part of expectations, part of what people consider normal or necessary. These ideas do not need to be repeated exactly as they were first presented, because they change slightly as they move, adapting to different contexts, different situations, but the core remains. The central belief that structure, control, and guided progress are essential for stability. Over time, this belief becomes less associated with a single individual and more associated with the way systems function, becoming part of the foundation rather than a separate influence. This is where the impact becomes deeper, because when an idea is no longer seen as coming from a single source, it becomes more stable, more difficult to challenge, more likely to continue without interruption. People begin to adopt these ideas not because they are told to, but because they appear logical, because they align with the results they see, because they fit within the structures that already exist around them. In this way, influence becomes self-sustaining, moving forward without the need for constant reinforcement. There are also institutions that carry this influence, organizations, systems, and networks that have been shaped over time to reflect certain principles, to operate in ways that support a specific direction. These institutions do not remain static, but they adapt, they respond to change, and in doing so, they carry the underlying ideas forward, ensuring that even as circumstances shift, the core structure remains intact. This creates a kind of continuity that extends beyond individual moments, beyond individual decisions, creating a lasting presence that does not rely on immediate control. From his perspective, this form of influence is more reliable than direct action alone, because it does not depend on constant attention, it does not require immediate response, and it can continue even when circumstances change in unexpected ways. It allows for flexibility within structure, for adaptation within control, and for growth that remains aligned with a central vision without needing to be constantly directed. At the same time, there is an awareness that this kind of influence changes the nature of power itself, because it moves away from the idea of dominance in a single moment and toward the idea of shaping the environment in which all moments occur. It is not about deciding one outcome, but about creating conditions where certain outcomes are more likely, where the direction of progress is guided without needing to control every step along the way. This understanding leads to a shift in focus, where success is no longer measured only by visible results, but by the stability of the systems that have been created, by the persistence of ideas. By the way, influence continues to move even in the absence of direct involvement. It is a quieter form of power, one that does not draw attention to itself, but is present in the background, shaping the world in ways that are not always immediately seen. There are moments where he reflects on this process, not with doubt, but with a kind of recognition, an understanding that what has been built is no longer limited to individual action, but exists within a larger structure that continues to grow and change. This does not remove the need for effort, but it changes its purpose, shifting from direct control to maintenance, from immediate action to long-term stability. He continues to refine this structure, to strengthen the connections that hold it together, to ensure that it remains effective even as new challenges arise, because influence, like any system, requires attention to remain stable, requires adjustment to remain aligned with its original purpose. This work is not always visible, but it is constant, shaping the way the system responds to change, ensuring that it continues to function as intended. Within this process, there is also a recognition that influence, once established, can extend beyond its original boundaries, reaching into areas that were not initially considered, shaping outcomes in ways that were not directly planned. And this creates both opportunity and complexity, because it means that the impact of a single idea can grow far beyond its original scope, affecting areas that require new understanding, new strategies, and new approaches. This expansion does not weaken the structure, but it requires careful attention because, as influence spreads, it interacts with other systems, other ideas, and other forces that may not align perfectly. And managing these interactions becomes part of maintaining stability, part of ensuring that the overall direction remains consistent even as new elements are introduced. In this way, the legacy that is formed is not fixed, but dynamic, not a static record of what has been achieved, but a living system that continues to evolve, to respond, and to shape the world in ways that extend far beyond any single moment. It is a reflection of a way of thinking, a way of approaching problems, a belief in the importance of structure and control, carried forward through systems, through people, and through the ongoing process of change. And as this legacy continues to take shape, as influence becomes more deeply embedded within the fabric of the world, there is a quiet understanding that this is a form of power that does not fade easily, that does not depend on immediate presence, and that can continue to guide outcomes long after the original source is no longer directly involved. For Lex Luthor, this realization does not bring an end to effort, but a refinement of it, a focus on ensuring that what has been built remains strong, remains effective, and continues to move in the direction he has set, even as time passes and circumstances change. Because in the end, the most lasting impact is not always found in the moments that are seen, but in the systems that continue to operate, in the ideas that continue to shape thought, and in the quiet, steady influence that remains long after the original action has passed, guiding the world in ways that are not always noticed, but always present. Moments of stillness, the man without the war. There are nights in every life when movement slows enough for thought to become louder than action, when the constant noise of responsibility, ambition, and conflict begins to fade into the background, leaving only silence and the uneasy clarity that silence often brings. And for Lex Luthor, these moments are rare, not because they are impossible, but because stillness itself has always felt dangerous, a space where questions can exist without immediate answers, where the mind is no longer occupied by systems to guide or problems to solve, but is left alone with itself. Most of his life has been shaped by movement, by planning, by directing outcomes before they unfold, and because of this, he has become deeply connected to purpose, to the idea that every action must lead somewhere, that every effort must support a larger structure. Yet there are moments, often late at night, when the city below grows quieter and the lights of Metropolis begin to blur into long reflections against glass windows, where the constant drive toward control loosens just enough for another kind of thought to appear, softer, slower, and more uncertain. In these moments, the world no longer feels like a system that must be managed, but simply a place that continues to exist whether he shapes it or not. And this realization creates a strange kind of distance, because without the constant focus on influence and direction, there remains the quieter question of identity, the question of who he is beneath the structures he has spent so many years building around himself. This question does not come easily, because it is not practical, it cannot be solved with strategy, and it does not produce immediate results. And for someone who has spent most of his life valuing efficiency and clarity, introspection feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, like standing in a room where there is nothing to control and nothing to improve. Yet the question remains, returning in brief moments when the pace of the world slows enough for it to be heard again. There are times when he looks out across the city and imagines a different kind of life, not in vivid detail, but in fragments, quiet possibilities that appear and disappear before they can fully settle into form. A life where mornings are not filled with plans and calculations, where conversations are not measured for usefulness or influence, where time is not divided into outcomes and objectives, but allowed to pass naturally without the need to direct it. These thoughts do not arrive with longing in the simple sense, but with curiosity, as if he is observing another version of existence that has always remained just beyond his reach. He wonders, though he would never speak it aloud, what it might feel like to live without constant resistance, without the need to prove, defend, or challenge, and whether such a life would feel empty or peaceful. Because conflict has been present for so long that it has become part of the structure of his thinking, part of how he understands purpose itself, and without it, there is uncertainty about what would remain. This uncertainty becomes even more noticeable when his thoughts turn towards Superman, because whether he admits it or not, much of his direction has formed in response to that presence, shaped by opposition, sharpened through comparison, and driven by the belief that the future must not belong to something beyond human control. Over time, this conflict has become more than an external struggle. It has become part of his identity, woven into the way he sees himself and the world around him. And so, the question begins to emerge quietly beneath everything else, not as a challenge, but as a reflection. Who is he without that conflict? If the struggle were to disappear, if the figure he has spent so many years studying, resisting, and defining himself against were suddenly absent, what direction would remain? Would the systems continue to matter in the same way? Would ambition still carry the same intensity? Would purpose remain as clear without an opposing force to shape it? These are not questions he enjoys considering, because they introduce a kind of uncertainty that cannot be fully controlled, and yet they continue to return during these rare moments of stillness, not demanding answers, but simply existing, waiting quietly beneath the surface of thought. There is also the deeper recognition that conflict itself has served as a kind of structure, something that keeps movement constant, something that prevents reflection from becoming too deep or too personal. As long as there is a challenge to confront, a system to shape, a threat to analyze, there is always another task to focus on, another reason to avoid looking too closely at what exists beneath the purpose. But in stillness, that protection weakens, and what remains is more human than he would prefer to acknowledge. He remembers fragments of earlier years, moments before influence became so vast, and before every decision carried the weight of systems and expectations. There were times when curiosity existed without rivalry, when intelligence felt connected to discovery rather than defense, and when the future seemed open in a different way, not yet narrowed by opposition and the need to maintain control. These memories do not bring regret exactly, but they create contrast, showing the distance between who he once was and who he has become. At times, he considers whether the path could have unfolded differently, whether another version of himself might have chosen creation without domination, leadership without resistance, ambition without the constant need to prove superiority. But even as these thoughts appear, there is an awareness that such possibilities belong to a world shaped by different conditions, different choices, and perhaps different fears. Because beneath the confidence, beneath the intellect, and beneath the carefully maintained composure, there has always existed a fear of losing significance, of becoming unnecessary in a world that continues moving forward. Conflict, in many ways, has protected him from that fear by ensuring that his role remains central, that his actions remain important, and that his mind remains engaged in something larger than himself. Without that conflict, there is the possibility of silence, and silence leaves space for questions that do not have clear answers. Yet, within these moments of reflection, there is also something softer, something almost peaceful, because for brief periods, the pressure to direct everything begins to fade, and the world no longer appears as something that must constantly be reshaped. The city lights continue to glow, people continue living their lives, and time continues moving without asking for guidance. And in observing this, there is a strange realization that existence itself does not always require control to continue. This realization does not change him completely, does not undo years of belief and structure, but it creates small openings in the certainty, moments where another perspective becomes visible, where the possibility of simply existing, rather than constantly directing, begins to feel imaginable, even if only for a short time. Still, by morning, the systems return, the responsibilities return, and the structure of purpose settles back into place. Because habit and identity are difficult things to separate from. Yet, those quiet moments remain important precisely because they are rare. Because they reveal that beneath the strategist, beneath the public figure, and beneath the endless pursuit of control, there is still a man capable of reflection. Still someone who wonders what life might look like, without war, without rivalry, and without the endless need to stand against something greater than himself. And perhaps most unsettling of all is the possibility that the answer to who he is without Superman may not be found in power or influence at all, but in the parts of himself he has spent most of his life trying not to examine too closely, the quieter parts that emerge only in stillness, when the noise of ambition fades just long enough for the truth to be heard. The endless cycle, rivalry without resolution. Some conflicts begin with a clear purpose and move toward a clear ending, where one side wins, the other falls, and the story settles into silence afterward. But the struggle between Lex Luthor and Superman does not move in that way, because from the very beginning, it has existed less like a single battle and more like a repeating pattern, something that rises, fades, and rises again, changing shape over time, but never truly disappearing. It is not held together only by anger or ideology, but by something deeper, something tied to the way each one defines himself in relation to the other, as if the presence of one creates the conditions for the existence of the other. Over the years, victories have come and gone, plans have succeeded and failed, cities have changed, systems have shifted, and the world itself has moved through periods of fear, hope, uncertainty, and recovery. Yet the conflict remains, returning again and again no matter how many times it seems to reach a conclusion. There are moments when the struggle grows quieter, moments when it appears as though both might finally move in separate directions, and yet something always draws them back toward the same point, the same unresolved tension that neither fully escapes. For many watching from the outside, the rivalry appears simple at first, a powerful man standing against another powerful figure, one relying on intellect and control, while the other relies on strength and compassion. But over time, the simplicity begins to fade, because repeated conflict reveals patterns, and those patterns suggest that what exists between them is not only opposition, but dependence, a connection formed through years of reaction, challenge, and constant comparison. Each one represents something the other cannot fully ignore. For Lex Luthor, Superman embodies a force that challenges his understanding of order, humanity, and earned power, a living contradiction to the systems he believes should guide the world. For Superman, Luthor represents something equally difficult, a reminder that human intelligence, when shaped by fear and pride, can become both extraordinary and deeply dangerous at the same time. They stand on opposite sides of an idea, yet they continue to orbit around the same central question: what should guide the future of humanity? This question never fully disappears, because neither side is able to completely answer it. Every time one believes he has proven his point, the other responds in a way that keeps the argument alive. When systems of control appear effective, acts of compassion reveal limits within those systems. When hope and trust inspire people to rise above fear, manipulation, and ambition, remind the world how fragile that hope can become. The balance shifts back and forth endlessly, not because either side is weak, but because each one carries a truth that cannot be entirely erased. There are periods where the rivalry becomes highly visible, where public attention turns toward direct confrontation, toward battles of influence, technology, or ideology. And in those moments, it can seem as though a final resolution is approaching. Yet once the conflict passes, once the immediate crisis settles, the deeper struggle remains untouched, because the true conflict was never only about defeating the other person. It has always been about proving that one vision of the world is more valid than the other. But visions are difficult things to destroy completely, especially when they are connected to larger human fears and hopes. The belief in control continues to exist because uncertainty frightens people, and the belief in hope continues to exist because people do not want to live only within systems of fear and calculation. As long as humanity carries both desires, the conflict between these two figures continues to reflect that division, turning their rivalry into something larger than themselves. Over time, this endless cycle begins to affect them in quieter ways as well. Decisions are no longer made in isolation, because each one anticipates the response of the other almost instinctively. Plans are designed with expectation already built into them, and actions are shaped not only by personal belief, but by years of understanding how the other thinks, reacts, and adapts. In this way, the rivalry becomes part of their identities, woven so deeply into their lives that separating from it completely begins to feel almost impossible. There are moments when this realization becomes visible, though neither would openly admit it. A temporary absence creates an unusual silence, not peaceful, but incomplete, as if something essential to the rhythm of the world has suddenly gone missing. Without opposition, purpose becomes less defined, and direction loses some of its sharpness. The struggle itself has become a structure, one that keeps both moving forward even while exhausting them at the same time. For Superman, the existence of someone like Luthor is a reminder that power alone cannot solve every problem, because human fear, ambition, and mistrust cannot simply be lifted away like falling steel or burning debris. And for Luthor, Superman remains the ultimate challenge, the one presence that forces him to constantly refine, rethink, and push beyond the limits of his own systems. Without that challenge, there is a possibility that his ambition might lose its central focus, becoming scattered rather than sharpened. This creates a strange balance between them, not peaceful, but stable in its own way, because neither side fully wins and neither side fully disappears. Instead, they continue shaping each other through conflict, each one forcing the other to evolve, adapt, and confront parts of themselves they might otherwise ignore. The rivalry becomes less like a straight line moving toward an ending, and more like a circle that continues repeating, changing slightly with each turn, but always returning to the same unresolved center. There is also something deeply human hidden within this endless repetition, because it reflects the larger struggles that exist inside society itself. People constantly move between the desire for safety and the desire for freedom, between trust and suspicion, between hope and fear. And these two figures, though extraordinary in their own ways, embody those same tensions on a larger scale. Their conflict continues because the questions they represent never fully disappear from the human experience. At times, there are brief moments where understanding almost seems possible, where each one recognizes something familiar in the other, not agreement, but recognition. They both carry isolation, both understand responsibility, and both believe they are protecting humanity in their own way. Yet these moments never last long enough to change the course of the rivalry, because the foundations beneath their beliefs remain too different, too deeply rooted to easily bridge. And so the cycle continues, not through simple hatred, but through a deeper connection built on opposition itself. Every action creates response, every plan creates counterplan, and every attempt to move beyond the conflict somehow leads back into it again. The world changes around them, generations rise and fall, technology advances, cities expand, and still the struggle remains, adapting with time, but never truly ending. Perhaps this is because the rivalry stopped being only personal long ago. It became symbolic, representing two visions of what humanity could become, one shaped through control and guided structure, the other through trust and moral choice. Neither vision fully erases the other, because both continue to exist within the world itself, within the fears and hopes carried by ordinary people every day. In quieter moments, there may even be an unspoken understanding between them that this struggle cannot end cleanly, because ending it would mean more than removing an enemy. It would mean removing a reflection, a challenge, a force that gives shape to their own identities. And so they continue, not simply because they want to defeat each other, but because in some strange and complicated way, they have become necessary to one another. The cycle moves forward endlessly, sometimes loud, sometimes silent, but always present beneath the surface of the world, like two opposing currents pulling against each other without ever fully breaking apart. And as long as humanity continues wrestling with fear, power, hope, and control, the struggle between Lex Luthor and Superman will continue as well, unfinished, unresolved, and forever balanced between destruction and understanding. The quiet mind at rest, power, pride, and peace. As the long movement of conflict begins to settle into distance, and the sharp edges of ambition slowly soften beneath the quiet passing of time, the story of Lex Luthor no longer feels only like the story of power, rivalry, or control, but like something quieter and more human. A story about the endless effort to rise above limitation and the difficult realization that no matter how intelligent, determined, or powerful a person becomes, there are still boundaries that cannot be completely escaped. For so much of his life, movement has defined him. Plans were always forming, systems were always evolving, and every moment seemed connected to another goal waiting further ahead, as if stillness itself was something dangerous, something that could allow uncertainty to enter if left unchecked for too long. Yet now, as the noise of endless struggle begins to fade into the background, another perspective slowly appears, gentler and less demanding, shaped not by victory or defeat, but by reflection. The city lights of Metropolis continue glowing in the distance, rising like scattered stars beneath the dark sky. And though the world still moves with all its familiar urgency, there is a sense that the pace no longer feels quite the same. The battles that once seemed absolute now appear smaller against the length of time, and the questions that once demanded immediate answers begin to drift more quietly through the mind, no longer sharp with pressure, but softened by understanding. There is something strange about reaching a point where ambition no longer feels endless, where even the strongest desire for control begins to loosen slightly beneath the weight of experience. Not because the need disappears completely, but because life itself slowly reveals how much of existence moves beyond anyone's ability to shape it fully. Cities change, generations pass, ideas evolve, and even the most carefully built structures eventually face the touch of time in ways no system can entirely prevent. For someone who spent years believing that enough intelligence could solve almost any problem, this realization does not arrive easily. It comes slowly, through repeated moments of uncertainty, through the recognition that some things cannot be perfectly predicted, and through the understanding that human life itself remains fragile no matter how much influence surrounds it. Yet within this realization, there is also a quiet kind of peace beginning to form, because the endless pressure to control every outcome starts to lose some of its hold. The rivalry with Superman, which once felt like the center around which everything else moved, now seems part of a much larger story, not simply a battle between two powerful figures, but a reflection of deeper fears and hopes that have always existed inside humanity itself. Fear of weakness, fear of irrelevance, fear of surrendering control over the future, all placed against the hope that strength can still be guided by compassion, that power can exist without domination, and that humanity can continue moving forward without losing itself. Looking back across the long path of his life, there are moments that feel heavy with consequence, and others that seem strangely quiet despite their importance. Decisions made in anger, choices shaped by pride, opportunities ignored because they did not fit within the structure he believed was necessary. And among all of these moments rests the lingering question that never fully disappears. Could another version of this life have existed? It is not a question about simple goodness or evil, because people are rarely that simple, and neither is he. Instead, it is a question about direction, about whether the same intelligence, the same ambition, and the same desire to protect humanity could have led somewhere different if fear had not become so closely tied to control. Because beneath all the strategy and certainty, there was always fear, though rarely spoken aloud. Fear that humanity would become weak, fear that dependence would erase progress, Fear that if no one stood above the chaos to guide it, everything would eventually collapse. But fear has a way of shaping even the brightest minds into something harder over time, narrowing possibilities until only one path appears acceptable. And perhaps that is where the tragedy truly rests, not in the existence of ambition itself, but in the gradual loss of trust, the slow belief that people cannot rise without being controlled, and that compassion alone is too fragile to protect the future. There are moments now where the world feels quieter than before, where the need to constantly prove something begins to fade, just enough for reflection to take its place. In these quieter spaces, it becomes easier to notice the smaller truths that once remained hidden beneath endless movement. The way pride can slowly become isolation. The way control can begin as protection, but grow into distance. The way intelligence, while powerful, cannot replace connection, trust, or peace. And yet, even with all of this understanding, there is no simple ending waiting here, no sudden transformation where every mistake disappears beneath clarity. Human beings rarely change so completely, especially after carrying the same beliefs for so long. Instead, what remains is softer and more uncertain, a gradual acceptance that life is more complicated than systems and outcomes alone, and that even the strongest mind cannot fully escape being human. The world itself continues forward without pause. Somewhere below, people walk through crowded streets, lights flicker inside apartment windows, trains move beneath the city, and ordinary lives continue with all their quiet hopes and fears. Most of them will never understand the full weight of the struggles that shape the figures standing above them, and perhaps that is for the best, because in the end, humanity was never meant to be reduced entirely into calculations and structures. It remains unpredictable, emotional, fragile, and imperfect, and yet somehow continues moving forward anyway. For all his efforts to guide the future, there is a possibility that the future was always going to belong not to perfect systems, but to imperfect people, learning slowly through failure, kindness, fear, and resilience. This thought would once have seemed deeply frustrating, almost unacceptable, but now it rests more quietly within the mind, no longer demanding immediate rejection. The long conflict begins to feel distant, not erased, but softened, like the fading sound of a storm moving further away across the horizon. The need to constantly resist, challenge, and control no longer carries the same sharp urgency it once did. What remains instead is reflection, and within reflection, there is the beginning of acceptance, not surrender, but understanding. Because perhaps the greatest limitation was never time, strength, or even failure itself, but the inability to fully trust that humanity could survive without being forced into order. And perhaps the deepest loneliness came not from standing against the world, but from standing apart from it for so long. As the night settles more fully across Metropolis, and the endless movement of the city softens into distant light and quiet sound, the story of Lex Luthor no longer feels like the story of a man trying to conquer the world, but of a man trying to protect it in the only way he believed possible, even when that belief slowly carried him further away from peace. And somewhere within that stillness rests the final question, gentle now rather than painful, drifting quietly through the silence without demanding an answer. In another life, with different fears, different choices, and a different understanding of what it means to be human, could Lex Luthor have become something else entirely? Perhaps. And perhaps that possibility, however distant, is what makes the story linger long after the conflict fades, not as a tale about monsters or heroes alone, but as a reminder that every person, no matter how brilliant or broken, exists between what they are and what they still might have been. As the lights of Metropolis begin to soften into the distance, and the long story of Lex Luthor slowly settles into silence, the endless struggle between ambition and peace no longer feels loud or heavy, but quiet, almost distant, like the fading echo of footsteps across empty city streets beneath the night sky. The towering buildings, the battles of intellect and power, the fear of weakness, and the need to control the future all begin to drift gently away, leaving behind only the image of a man who spent his life trying to shape the world into something safer, stronger, and more certain, even as that pursuit slowly carried him further from stillness itself. And now, as the noise fades and the city rests beneath the calm glow of distant windows, you can let these thoughts soften as well, allowing the story to settle quietly into the dark, where questions no longer need answers and conflict no longer needs resolution. Somewhere above the sleeping world, the night grows still, the skyline grows silent, and everything slowly becomes calm, quiet, and at rest.